The sun was a merciless hammer on the anvil of the sky, beating down on the canyon until the air shimmered and danced. Dust, fine as ground meal, coated everything. The sweat-slicked hide of Eli's horse, the brim of his hat, the back of his throat. It was a thirsty land, a place that bleached bone and broke spirits. Eli McAllister knew its language well. He'd ridden these trails for years, ever since Greystone had become less a home and more a place to anchor his solitude. He'd just delivered a fine-boned mare to the Miller Ranch, a 2-day ride south. The silver coins in his pocket felt thin and light, hardly worth the journey, but work was work. It kept a man's hands busy and his mind from wandering down trails he'd long since learned were dead ends. His horse, a steady buckskin named Dust Devil, plodded along the narrow track, its hooves kicking up small puffs of ochre earth. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with the golden grit of the ever-present dust. The silence was vast, broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves and the sigh of a hot wind whispering through brittle sagebrush. It was in that profound silence that he saw her. At first, she was just a heap of rags slumped against a jagged rock outcropping, a trick of the heat-addled light. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a person, a woman. She was collapsed on the ground, her body curled inward as if to protect a vital, wounded core. One arm was flung out, the hand limp in the dirt. Beside it lay a small, worn satchel, clutched tight in her other hand. Eli reined Dust Devil to a halt, his own body tensing with a caution learned from years of navigating a world where trouble often wore the face of helplessness. He swung down from the saddle, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He approached slowly, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt, not in aggression, but in readiness. The desert taught a man that a moment's hesitation could be his last. "Ma'am?" His voice was rough from disuse, scraping his dry throat. There was no response. He knelt, his shadow falling over her. She was young, maybe not even 20. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was matted with dirt and tangled with bits of twig and leaf. A long, dark dress, the kind a respectable woman might wear for travel, was torn at the shoulder and hem, its dark fabric powdered with grime. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see a dark bruise swelling along her jawline, ugly and purple against her pale skin. One of her feet was bare, the sole a mess of cuts and blisters. The other was still shod in a simple, worn leather shoe, but the stocking was shredded, soaked with blood that had dried to a dark crust. He reached out a hand, meaning only to check if she was breathing, but the moment his fingers brushed her shoulder, she flinched so violently it was like he'd struck her with a hot iron. Her eyes flew open. They were the color of a stormy sky, wide and frantic with a terror so deep it seemed to swallow all reason. She scrambled backward, crab-walking through the dirt, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She clutched the satchel to her chest like a shield. "Easy now," Eli said, keeping his voice low and steady, showing her his empty hands. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze darted from his face to the horse, then to the wide, empty canyon around them, looking for an escape that wasn't there. She was a cornered animal, ready to fight or bolt, even if it meant running herself to death. She didn't make a sound, not a whimper or a cry. The silence was more unsettling than any scream. It spoke of a pain so familiar it no longer needed a voice. Eli stayed where he was, kneeling in the dust, giving her space. He saw the tremble in her hands, the way she pressed herself against the hot rock as if trying to merge with it, to disappear entirely. He'd seen that look before, in wild horses before they were broken, and in men after a battle, when the noise had stopped but the horror hadn't. "You're hurt bad," he said, his voice gentle. "Your foot needs tending." He gestured with his chin toward her bleeding foot. "You can't stay out here. The sun will kill you before the night does." She just stared, her eyes tracking his every move, Every subtle shift in his weight. He could see the calculation in them, the desperate weighing of one danger against another. He was a man, large and armed. To her, that likely made him the greatest danger of all. He sighed, a long, weary breath that stirred the dust at his knees. He could ride on, leave her to her fate. It was the way of this land. You didn't take on another's trouble. You had enough of your own. But then he looked at the raw terror in her eyes. And something in him, a part he thought long dead and buried, refused to let him go. He couldn't save his brother. He couldn't hold on to the woman he was meant to marry. But he could, right now, stop this girl from dying in the dirt. Slowly, as if moving through deep water. He stood up and walked back to his horse. He unstrapped his canteen and returned, setting it on the ground a few feet from her. "Water," he said simply. He backed away again, giving her a wide berth. Her eyes followed the canteen, a flicker of desperate thirst crossing her features before being stamped out by fear. For a long minute, she didn't move. Then, her movements jerky and uncertain, she reached for it. Her hands shook so much she could barely unscrew the cap. She drank in greedy, choking gulps, water spilling down her chin and onto the front of her filthy dress. When she was done, she screwed the cap back on and pushed the canteen away, as if refusing any further debt. Eli knew then that he couldn't leave her. He walked back to his horse. "I'm going to lift you up," he said, his back to her, his voice calm and factual. "I'm taking you to my cabin. It's not far. You'll be safe there." He didn't wait for an answer he knew wouldn't come. He turned and walked toward her, his movements deliberate and slow. She flinched and tried to push herself further into the rock, but she was too weak. When he reached down, she squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear leaking from one corner, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her whole body went rigid with dread. Eli was as gentle as he knew how to be. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sharp bones and fear. He lifted her easily. She kept her face turned away, her body stiff as a board in his arms. He carried her to Dust Devil, who stood patiently, unbothered. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured to the horse, then to the girl. "Almost there." He mounted first, then carefully drew her up to sit in front of him. She tried to hold herself away from him, her back straight, her hands clutching her precious satchel to her chest. He didn't force it. He just held the reins in one hand and kept the other loosely around her waist to keep her from falling, his touch as light as he could make it. He nudged Dust Devil with his heels, and they started the slow ride toward Greystone. The town of Greystone clung to the edge of the valley like a scab on a wound. It was a place of hard-bitten people with narrow eyes and narrower minds. Its dust was meaner, its secrets uglier than most. Eli had built his cabin a good mile out, close enough to get supplies but far enough to avoid the rot. He didn't want their judgment, and he sure as hell didn't want their company. As they rode, he felt the girl's rigid posture slowly begin to fail. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. Her head began to droop, and soon her back was resting against his chest. She was so still he wondered if she'd passed out, but he could feel the faint, terrified flutter of her heartbeat against his ribs. His cabin was small, just one room, built of sturdy pine he'd cut and hauled himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a small cot on one side and a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs on the other. It was sparse, clean, and solitary. It was his sanctuary. He brought her inside, the setting sun casting long, intrusive shadows through the open door. He laid her gently on his cot. She immediately curled onto her side, facing the wall, making herself as small as possible. For the next 3 days, she did not speak a word. She was a silent ghost in his small home, a specter of pain. Her eyes, however, were never still. They followed him, tracking his every movement with a wary, desperate intensity. When he moved too quickly, she would flinch. When his voice, even speaking to the horse outside, rose above a low murmur, her body would tense, ready for a blow. It was clear to Eli that she had not just been hurt, she had been systematically broken by a man's hand. The thought coiled in his gut like a cold snake. He did what he could. He found a basin and filled it with warm water from the kettle, adding a bit of lye soap. He took a clean rag and gently bathed the cuts on her feet, his touch practiced and impersonal. She endured it with her eyes squeezed shut, her jaw tight, but she didn't pull away. He found a pair of his own trousers and a soft flannel shirt, laying them at the foot of the cot. They would be far too big for her, but they were clean. After he left the cabin to give her privacy, she put them on, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs. She left her torn, dirty dress in a heap on the floor, and Eli took it outside and burned it. Whatever life it belonged to, she was done with it. He gave her the cabin, taking his bedroll and sleeping on the small porch outside, under the cold, distant gaze of the stars. He'd close the door, leaving it unlatched, and lie there listening to the night sounds, his mind a churn of unwanted memories. He'd keep watch, his rifle beside him, though he wasn't sure what he was watching for. Lying there in the dark, the past would come for him, unbidden. He'd see his younger brother, Thomas, not as he was at the end, but as a boy with a wide, easy grin and hay in his hair. Thomas had been wild but good-hearted, quick to laugh and quicker to love. He'd fallen for the wrong girl, the daughter of a cattleman with a grudge against the McAllister name. When some of the man's cattle went missing, Thomas was the first one they blamed. Sheriff Brody, a man whose sense of justice was for sale to the highest bidder, didn't bother with a trial. He'd organized a posse, dragged Thomas from their family home, and strung him up from the big oak tree just outside of town. Eli had been away on a cattle drive. He came home to a fresh grave and a silence in the house that was louder than any scream. He saw the smug satisfaction on Brody's face when Eli had confronted him. He got what he deserved. McAllister, best you move on before you find yourself in a similar predicament. Justice. Eli used to believe in the word. He'd seen it twisted into a noose. Not long after, another memory would surface. This one sharper, a different kind of ache. Clara, her face framed by dark curls, her eyes full of promises. They were to be married that spring. But after Thomas's death, a shadow fell over Eli. A cold, hard anger he couldn't shake. He became quiet, distant. He was a man marked by tragedy, and Clara wanted a life of sunlight and laughter, not shadows. Her letter had been polite, full of sorrow and regret. She was leaving Greystone, going back east. She wished him well. He'd read it once, then burned it, watching the edges of the paper curl and blacken, taking her promises with them into ash. He'd lost everything that mattered in the shadow of that one town, and now he had brought a piece of fresh trouble right back to his doorstep. On the morning of the fourth day, he was outside splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort in the quiet dawn. He heard a soft sound behind him, and turned. She was standing in the doorway, pale and thin in his oversized clothes, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks of the porch. Her hair was clean now. She must have washed it in the basin. It fell around her shoulders in pale, damp waves. She watched him for a long moment, her throat working as if she were trying to form words that wouldn't come. He stopped his work, resting the axe head on the chopping block, and waited. Finally, her voice emerged, a raw, fragile whisper, barely disturbing the morning air. I won't go back to him. The words were a statement, a plea, and a prayer all at once. She didn't say who he was. She didn't need to. The terror in her eyes filled in the rest of the story. Eli looked at her, at this broken, silent girl who had finally found her voice to say the only thing that mattered. He saw the ghosts of his own failures, the shadow of the brother he couldn't protect. He thought of the town over the rise, with its cruel whispers and its bought and paid-for sheriff. He knew what it meant to offer this girl sanctuary. It meant inviting a war to his doorstep. He didn't hesitate. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. His own voice was soft, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable oath. "Then you won't—" A week later, the trouble he'd expected arrived, though not with guns drawn. It came in the form of cold shoulders and closed doors. He rode into Greystone for supplies, his list modest: flour, coffee, salt, and some bandages. When he walked into the general store, the usual low chatter of morning gossip died instantly. Old man Abernathy, the clerk, stood behind the counter, his face pinched and sour. "McAllister," he said, his tone clipped. "Abernathy," Eli replied. Nodding, he began listing what he needed. Abernathy held up a hand. "Can't sell you anything today." Eli stopped. "You're well stocked. I can see the flour from here." "My store, my rules," the clerk said, not meeting Eli's eye. He busied himself rearranging a display of tinned peaches. "Folks are talking about that girl you're keeping out at your place. A runaway, they say, belonging to someone important." Eli's jaw tightened. "She belongs to no one, and what I do on my land is my business." "Not when it brings trouble to the whole town." Abernathy sniffed, his courage growing now that he'd said his piece. "Word is, she's damaged goods, a woman of ill repute. We're a decent town. McAllister, we don't hold with that sort of thing." Eli's hand twitched. The urge to reach across the counter and wipe the smug look off Abernathy's face was a physical thing, a fire in his veins, but he held it back. Brawling in a store wouldn't help the girl. It would only confirm their worst suspicions. He turned without another word and walked out, the silent stares of the other customers like daggers in his back. He left town with an empty supply sack and a belly full of cold rage. The rumors were spreading. Greystone was closing ranks. Back at the cabin, a fragile and unspoken normalcy was taking root. The girl, whom he had started to think of as Hope, for that was what she seemed to be clinging to, had begun to emerge from her shell of silence. She still didn't speak much, but she began to act. One afternoon, he came in from checking his fences to find she had taken the salt pork and beans he had and made a thick, passable stew. It sat warming by the fire, and the smell made the small cabin feel, for the first time in a long time, like a home. Another day, he found a shirt of his, one with a tear in the sleeve, lying folded on his cot. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of small, neat stitches. He ran his thumb over the mend. It was the work of someone who knew how to make things whole again. She moved around the cabin with a quiet grace, sweeping the floor with a broom made of tied branches, washing their few dishes in the basin. They were small acts, but they were the foundations of a life, fragile as a bird's nest. But the fear was always there, a shadow just beneath the surface, a horse kicking the side of the stable, a log shifting and popping in the fire, the distant crack of a hunter's rifle. Any loud, sudden sound would make her jump, her whole body recoiling as if from a physical blow, and she flinched from touch. If their hands brushed as he passed her a plate, she would snatch hers back as if burned. He learned to move slowly around her, to announce his presence, to keep a careful distance. He was building a bridge to her, one painstakingly placed plank at a time, across a chasm of fear he could only guess at. One evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, a great, bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the last of the daylight. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, and rain began to lash against the single window pane. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting apart, and the little cabin shook. Eli was sitting at the table, cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical movements a balm to his restless mind. Hope was sitting on a low stool by the hearth, watching the flames. With every clap of thunder, her shoulders would hunch and her hands would clench in the fabric of the trousers she wore. She was trying to hide it, but he could see the terror she was fighting to control. He finished with the rifle and set it aside. The cabin was quiet between the booms of thunder. The only sounds, the hiss of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. In that quiet, she spoke. Her voice was so low he almost didn't hear it over the storm. "Why?" He looked at her. She was staring into the fire, her profile etched by the flickering light. "Why what?" he asked. She turned her head, and her storm-blue eyes met his across the small room. "Why are you kind to me?" The question was simple, direct, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had no answer for her, not a simple one. He couldn't tell her that her brokenness reminded him of his own. He couldn't explain that in her silence. He heard the echoes of all the things he'd lost. He couldn't say that protecting her felt like the first right thing he'd done since he'd laid his brother in the ground. These were truths too heavy to be spoken aloud. They were the private language of a man's soul, and he had long since forgotten how to translate them. So he didn't answer. He stood up, took the spare woolen blanket from the foot of his cot, and walked over to her. He didn't try to put it around her shoulders. He knew she would flinch. Instead, he just held it out to her. She looked at the blanket, then back at his face, her expression searching, confused. After a moment, she took it from him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. She wrapped it around herself, pulling it tight. Eli looked toward the cot, then back at the door that led to the porch where he slept. The wind shrieked, and a fresh torrent of rain hammered the roof. He couldn't send her out there, and he wouldn't leave her alone inside. He walked to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place, the sound loud in the charged silence. He turned back to her. "Sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's fury. He gestured to the cot. "I'll keep watch." Then he settled into one of the hard wooden chairs at the table, the one that faced the door, and prepared to wait out the storm. Both the one outside his cabin and the one raging inside the girl on the cot. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river, and Eli knew it was bound to break. For 2 weeks, a quiet routine had settled over the cabin. He and Hope moved around each other with a practiced, wordless understanding. He would rise before dawn to see to the horses, and she would have coffee boiling on the fire when he came back inside. They spoke little, but a language was forming between them nonetheless, in shared glances, in plates of food passed without asking, in the simple, steady rhythm of two solitary people sharing a space. But the silence of the cabin could not hold back the noise of the town. His supplies were nearly gone. The flour sack was flat. The coffee tin held only a few beans rattling at the bottom. He had managed to shoot a deer, and they had meat. But a man could not live on venison alone. He needed salt, flour, ammunition. He needed to go to town. He put it off for as long as he could. But the day came when he had no choice. He told Hope he was riding in. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes before she masked it. "Be careful," was all she said, her voice a whisper. He nodded, took his hat, and left, the weight of her worry following him down the trail. The moment he rode into Greystone's Main Street, he felt the change. Doors that would have been open were closed. The few people he saw on the boardwalk stopped their conversations, turning to watch him pass with cold, hostile eyes. The air was thick with judgment. He tied Dust Devil in front of the saloon, not the general store. If Abernathy would not sell to him, the saloon was the only other place a man could buy a drink and, sometimes, get what he needed through barter or a game of cards. He pushed through the swinging doors, and the familiar smell of sour whiskey, stale tobacco, and unwashed men hit him. The place was dim, sunlight struggling through the grimy windows. A few men were at the bar. A few more sat around a card table in the corner. Every one of them looked up as he entered. The bartender, a burly man named Silas with a stained apron and a perpetual scowl, stopped wiping a glass. "McAllister," Silas grunted. It was not a greeting. It was an accusation. Eli walked to the bar, his boots loud on the dusty floorboards. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low, He laid 2 coins on the scarred wood. Silas poured the drink, his movements slow and deliberate. As Eli reached for the glass, a man detached himself from the card table and swaggered over. His name was Jedediah Kane, a loudmouthed ranch hand who worked for the biggest landowner in the county. Kane was a big man, running to fat, with a cruel mouth and small, piggish eyes. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Kane sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Thought you'd be too busy playing house to show your face in a decent establishment." Eli ignored him, lifting the glass to his lips. The whiskey was cheap and burned all the way down. He needed its fire. Kane leaned an elbow on the bar, crowding Eli's space. "We hear you found yourself some company. A little runaway stray. Real charitable of you. McAllister, taking in another man's property." Eli set the glass down with a deliberate click. He turned his head slowly and met Kane's gaze. "She's not property," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "And she's not your concern." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Not my concern? Friend, when a man like Cyrus Bragg is missing something he's paid for, it becomes everyone's concern. Bragg don't like thieves." The name landed in the room with a heavy thud. Cyrus Bragg. He was more legend than man in these parts, a spider who had spun a web of debt and fear across the entire valley. He owned the biggest ranch, the most cattle, and half the businesses in Greystone. He bought land from men who fell on hard times, foreclosing with a smile. And, as the whispers went, he bought other things too. Men said he had a taste for young, frightened women, ordering them through catalogs like he would a new saddle or a prize bull. He was a powerful man, and the town lived in the shadow of his cruelty. "The girl ain't a whore. Kane." A quiet voice spoke up from the end of the bar. It was old Doc Miller, a man who had seen too much to be easily intimidated. "She was hurt bad. A man's got a right to help someone in need." Kane spat a stream of tobacco juice near the doctor's boots. "She's a whore runaway is what she is, and McAllister there is hiding her. Bragg paid good money for her. That makes her his... He's just keeping her warm for him." The men at the card table snickered. Eli felt a familiar rage begin to build in his chest. A cold, clean fire. It was the same rage he'd felt when he heard about his brother. The rage of injustice, of the strong preying on the weak. "You've said your piece, Kane," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "Now back away from my table." "Or what?" Kane challenged, puffing out his chest. "You'll fight for her. Don't seem worth the trouble. From what I hear, she's damaged goods anyway." That was the line, the one that snapped the leash on Eli's control. It was not just an insult to hope. It was a branding, a declaration that she was a thing, broken and worthless. Eli moved so fast, Kane didn't have time to react. He didn't draw his gun. This was not a fight of honor. This was a punishment. He pivoted on his heel, and his right fist connected with Kane's jaw with a crack that echoed in the silent room. Kane's head snapped back, his eyes rolling up in his head. He crumpled to the floor like a sack of grain, out cold before he hit the sawdust. Eli stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles screaming with pain. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the saloon. "Anyone else have something to say about the girl?" he asked, his voice a low growl. No one spoke. Even Silas the bartender seemed to have frozen in place. The hatred in the room was a physical thing now, thick and suffocating. He had not just struck Kane. He had struck a man who worked for Cyrus Bragg. He had defied the unspoken king of the valley. He threw another coin on the bar. "For the mess," he said. Then he turned and walked out of the saloon, the swinging doors flapping shut behind him, leaving a silence as profound as a grave. He rode back to the cabin with a storm raging inside him. His knuckles were bruised and swelling, a dull throb that matched the pounding in his head. He had bought them a little more time, perhaps. But he had also painted a target on his own back, and on Hope's. He had declared war on Cyrus Bragg without even meaning to. When he reached the cabin, Hope was waiting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself. She saw his hand first, the raw, scraped skin over his knuckles. Her eyes, wide with alarm, flew to his face. She saw the grim set of his jaw, the cold fire still burning in his eyes. She didn't have to ask what had happened. She knew. He stumped past her into the cabin, tossing his hat onto a peg. He was too angry to speak, too full of a violence that he didn't want her to see. He went to the water basin and plunged his throbbing hand into the cold water, hissing as the pain sharpened. She followed him inside, her movements hesitant. She stood a few feet away, her hands twisting in the folds of the oversized shirt she wore. "They know about me," she said. It was not a question. Eli grunted in affirmation, not turning around. "They said his name?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He finally turned to look at her. Her face was chalk white, her eyes huge and dark with a terror he now understood was not just a memory, but a living, breathing threat. "Bragg," he said, the name tasting like poison. "They said you belonged to a man named Cyrus Bragg." A shudder went through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She looked down at the floor, her hair falling forward to hide her face. He saw her shoulders shaking. She was crying, but silently, the way she did everything, as if making a sound was a luxury she couldn't afford. He felt his anger drain away, replaced by a deep, aching helplessness. He took a step toward her, then stopped. He wanted to comfort her, to put his arms around her and tell her she was safe. But his hands were the hands of a man who had just used them for violence. He was afraid to touch her. She finally lifted her head, her cheeks wet with tears. "He didn't buy me," she said, her voice thick with shame. "He bought my father's debts." She began to speak then, the words tumbling out in a broken, halting rush, as if a dam had finally burst. She told him of a stepfather who smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation, a man whose hands were either closed into fists or open for a handout. She spoke of gambling debts, of a farm failing under a mountain of bad decisions, and she spoke of Cyrus Bragg, who had come to their small, impoverished farm, not as a savior, but as a vulture. "My stepfather, he offered Bragg our last 2 cows, she whispered, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "But Bragg said he wasn't interested in livestock. He looked at me. He said a pretty, healthy girl of marrying age was worth more than any 2 cows. He said he'd forgive all the debts, in exchange for a signed marriage contract." She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "I was to be his wife. I saw the papers. It was all legal. My stepfather signed them. He sold me for a handful of silver and a clear slate." She explained how she was supposed to be delivered to Bragg's ranch the following week. A local preacher already paid to perform the ceremony. But the night before, she had packed the few things she owned, a spare dress, her mother's locket, into her small satchel and run. She had run all night and all the next day, through scrubland and canyons, until her feet were raw and her lungs burned and she couldn't run anymore. That's where he had found her, collapsed and bleeding at the side of the trail. Eli listened, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The rage was back, but it was a different kind now. It was a cold, killing rage, directed at a world that allowed men like her stepfather and Cyrus Bragg to exist. He pictured Bragg's face, a man he'd only seen from a distance in town, always well-dressed, always smiling a predator's smile. He imagined what that man would have done to this girl, to her quiet spirit, to her fragile hope. His own hands began to tremble, and he curled them into fists to still them. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the cabin. Hope stood before him, exposed and vulnerable, as if she had just confessed to a terrible crime. She finally risked a glance at his face, and what she saw there must have frightened her, because she took a small step back. He saw her fear, The fear that he was just another man who would judge her, who would see her as tainted, as used. He forced his hands to relax. He took a deep breath. "You don't owe anyone your body," he said, his voice rough but steady. Each word was a stone laid in the foundation of a new truth. "Not your stepfather, not Bragg." He looked her straight in the eye, willing her to believe him. Not even God. For the first time since he'd met her, he saw something other than fear or sorrow in her eyes. It was a flicker of stunned disbelief, as if he had just spoken to her in a language she had never heard but had always longed to understand. That conversation changed something between them. A wall had come down. She started to trust him, not just as a protector, but as a man. She watched him with a new curiosity. She saw the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses, the patience he showed when a young colt was skittish. She watched the fluid, powerful grace of his movements as he chopped wood, the muscles in his back and shoulders working under his thin shirt. She saw the way he cleaned the cabin, his movements as precise and methodical as when he was cleaning his rifle. He was a man of quiet competence, of deep, unspoken convictions. One afternoon, she came outside while he was target practicing, setting up empty bottles on a fence post. "Show me," she said, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her, surprised. The revolver was heavy and loud. It was a tool of violence, but he saw the resolve in her face. This was not about aggression. It was about survival. So he agreed. He showed her how to stand, how to hold the heavy Colt with both hands to steady it. He showed her how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger gently, not pull it. The first time she fired it, the recoil sent her stumbling backward, and the shot went wide, kicking up dirt 10 feet from the target. Her ears rang, and her eyes were wide with shock. But she didn't drop the gun. She set her jaw, took a deep breath, and raised it again. He stayed with her for an hour, patiently correcting her stance, reloading the weapon, murmuring words of encouragement. By the end, she was able to hit one of the bottles, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips, and Eli felt something warm unfold in his chest. He was not just teaching her to shoot. He was giving her back a piece of the power that had been stolen from her. A few days later, he was in the small stable, saddling Dust Devil for a ride to check his fence lines. He was cinching the saddle tight when he sensed her presence behind him. He turned, and she was standing there, in the slivers of dusty sunlight slanting through the boards of the stable wall. She stepped forward, and, before he could react, she laid her hand gently on his chest, right over his heart. Her touch was feather-light, hesitant. Through the fabric of his shirt, he could feel the warmth of her palm, and his heart gave a sudden, hard thud against it. He stiffened instantly. Every muscle in his body went rigid. It was a reflex born of years of solitude, of keeping the world at arm's length. The touch was too intimate, too close to the wounded thing he kept locked away inside him. She felt his reaction and immediately pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. A look of hurt crossed her face, and she took a step away. "I am sorry," she whispered, looking down at her feet. "It is not you," he said quickly, his voice hoarse. She looked up at him then, and her eyes were full of a startling clarity. She saw past his rough exterior, past the hardened walls he had built around himself. "You're good," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet certainty that shook him to his core. "But you look like a man who doesn't believe he deserves anything kind." Her words hit him harder than Cain's fist had. She had seen the truth of him, the rotten, hollow place where guilt and grief had taken root, the part of him that believed he had failed his brother, that he had driven Clara away, that he was not worthy of a simple, gentle touch. He had no answer for her. He just turned back to the horse, his hands fumbling with the saddle straps. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts now. Outside the cabin, there was the town and Cyrus Bragg, but inside, there was a battle with himself. He was growing to care for this girl, more than he wanted to admit. He saw her strength, her resilience. He found himself watching the way the firelight caught in her pale hair, the way her lips curved in a small, rare smile when one of the horses nudged her hand. A deep, primal longing began to stir in him, something he thought had been buried with his past. He wanted her, but the thought terrified him. He was afraid of his own roughness, of the darkness inside him. He was afraid of becoming just another man who would break her spirit, who would take from her what was not his to take. The tension between them grew, a taut wire humming in the small space of the cabin. It culminated one night, a week after the incident in the stable. A full moon hung in the sky, bathing the world in a soft, silver light that streamed through the cabin's window. They had eaten their dinner in their usual near silence. Eli was cleaning a bridle, the smell of leather and oil filling the air. Hope was mending one of his shirts by the light of a single candle on the table. He looked up and found her watching him, her eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering candlelight. She put down her sewing, the needle and thread resting on the rough-spun fabric. She stood up and walked around the table until she was standing in front of him. He froze, the piece of oiled leather still in his hand. She reached out and gently took it from his grasp, setting it on the table. Then she placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was no longer hesitant. It was deliberate, and it sent a jolt through him. "Eli," she whispered, the first time she had ever said his name. Before he could speak, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss born of desperation and a deep, aching loneliness. It was hesitant at first, then deepened as she pressed herself against him, seeking a warmth and a connection she had been starved of her entire life. For a moment, Eli was lost in it. His own need rose up to meet hers, a powerful, undeniable force. His arms came up to wrap around her, to pull her closer. But then the image of her, broken and terrified at the side of the trail, flashed in his mind. He thought of Bragg. He thought of his own bruised knuckles. He was a man of violence, a man surrounded by trouble. What could he offer her but more of the same? He would break her. He was sure of it. With a strength born of pure terror, he pulled away. He gripped her shoulders and gently but firmly set her back from him. He was breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was shaken to his very soul. Hope stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The rejection was a visible blow. Her face crumpled, and she turned away from him, a choked sob escaping her lips. She didn't go to the cot. Instead, she sank to the floor by the hearth, wrapping the woolen blanket around herself, her back to him. The fire cast her small, hunched figure in a warm, flickering light. But she looked colder and more alone than he had ever seen her. Eli stood by the table, his body rigid, his soul in torment. He wanted to go to her, to explain, but he had no words. What could he say? That he wanted her so much he was afraid he would shatter her? The silence stretched, thick and painful, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He thought she had retreated back into her shell, that he had broken the fragile trust they had built. But then she spoke, her voice trembling but filled with a strange, unnerving resolve. She did not turn to look at him. She spoke to the flames, to the darkness, to the truth that lived between them. "The pain you're afraid to give me," she said, her voice cracking but clear. "I already live in it." Her words hung in the air between them, heavier than the silence that followed. "The pain you're afraid to give me, I already live in it." Eli felt them like a brand on his soul, searing away the last of his carefully constructed distance. He had no reply. There was nothing to say to a truth that stark, that terrible. The night passed in a state of armed truce with their own hearts. He sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, and she lay on the cot, wrapped in her blanket, a small, still shape in the darkness. But the space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with her confession, with a raw and aching vulnerability that left him feeling like a trespasser in his own home. The next 2 days were quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a space of healing. but a tense, watchful quiet, the kind that comes before a storm breaks or a fever spikes. He knew Bragg would not let the insult in the saloon go unanswered. A man like that, whose power was built on fear, could not afford to look weak. It was not a matter of if, but when. The when came on a bright, cold morning. A brisk wind was chasing clouds across the sky, and the air smelled of pine and distant rain. Eli was coming back from the well, a heavy bucket of water in each hand, when he heard it, the rhythmic drumming of horses' hooves, too many for a lone rider. He stopped dead, his eyes scanning the low rise to the east. 3 riders appeared, their shapes dark against the morning sky. They were not moving with purpose, but with the lazy arrogance of men who believe they own the ground they ride on. He dropped the buckets, water splashing over his boots, and strode quickly to the cabin. He opened the door without a word and pointed to the loose floorboards under the cot he'd shown her once. A small, dusty crawl space meant for storing roots and potatoes through the winter. Get in, now. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Hope's face went pale, all the color draining from it until her eyes looked like dark bruises. She didn't question him. She scrambled to the cot, pulled the rough-hewn plank aside, and slid into the dark, earthy-smelling hole. She pulled the board back into place just as he shut the cabin door behind him. He took his rifle from its pegs by the door, checked the action, and leaned it against the wall. Within easy reach, he wanted his hands free. Then he stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut, and waited. The 3 riders trotted into his small yard, their horses kicking up dust. The man in the lead was big and bearded, with a mean slant to his mouth. Eli recognized him as Harlan, one of Bragg's foremen. The other 2 were younger, with the kind of empty, cruel faces that men who enjoy their work for the wrong reasons often have. "McAllister," Harlan called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. He didn't dismount. He looked down at Eli from his saddle as if he were an insect. "We've come for what's ours." Eli stayed on the porch, his feet planted, his arms crossed over his chest. He kept his expression neutral, his voice level. "I don't have anything that belongs to you, Harlan, or to your boss." Harlan chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Mr. Bragg says different. He says a piece of his property ran off, and that you've been keeping it here, a little blonde girl. Answers to the name Hope. We've come to take her back." "There's no girl here," Eli said, his voice flat. It was a lie, but it was the only shield he could offer her. "Is that so?" Harlan swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling. The other 2 men followed suit, spreading out, their hands hovering near the pistols on their hips. "Jedediah Kane seems to think otherwise. Says you got real protective of the subject. Cost him 2 teeth and a week's pay." Harlan took a step toward the porch. "We can do this easy, or we can do this hard, Mr. Bragg ain't particular. Just as long as the girl is returned. He's a forgiving man, but his patience is thin." "Then he'd best go look for her somewhere else," Eli said, not moving a muscle. "You're on my land. I'd advise you to leave it." Harlan's smile was all teeth. "I don't think so. We're going to have a look inside that cabin of yours, and if we find you've been lying—" He let the threat hang in the air. He started up the 2 short steps to the porch. That was as far as he got. Eli exploded into motion. He had not survived years in hard country by waiting for another man to make the first move. He launched himself off the porch, his shoulder driving hard into Harlan's chest. The bigger man grunted, the air rushing from his lungs, and stumbled backward. Before he could recover, Eli's fist connected with his jaw, a short, brutal punch that sent him sprawling in the dirt. One of the younger men cursed and reached for his gun, but he was too slow. Eli spun, his boot lashing out in a vicious kick to the man's knee. The man screamed as the joint gave way with a sickening pop, and he went down, clutching his ruined leg. The 3rd man had his pistol out, but he hesitated. his eyes wide with shock at the sudden, savage violence. It was all the time Eli needed. He lunged, grabbing the man's gun hand and twisting. The wrist snapped with a dry crack. The pistol fell to the dirt. Eli slammed his elbow into the man's face, and he collapsed, unconscious, a river of blood pouring from his nose. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Eli stood breathing heavily in the quiet yard. The only sounds, the whimpering of the man with the broken leg and the nervous stamping of the horses. Harlan was trying to push himself up, dazed, spitting blood and dirt. Eli walked over to him, picked up the pistol from the ground, and pointed it at Harlan's head. The foreman froze, his eyes wide with fear. "Go back to Bragg," Eli said, his voice a low, deadly whisper. "You tell him this is my only warning. The girl is not his. She is not a piece of property. You tell him if he sends men here again, I won't send them back breathing. You tell him to stay away." He stepped back and fired the pistol into the dirt, an inch from Harlan's head. The foreman yelped and scrambled backward. Eli turned to the man with the broken knee. "Get him on his horse and get out of here." The man, pale and sweating with pain, managed to drag his unconscious partner onto his horse and then, with great effort, helped Harlan into his saddle. They rode away, not looking back, leaving a cloud of dust and the tang of fear in the air. Eli waited until they were out of sight before he allowed the tension to drain from his body. He felt a tremor in his hands and forced them into fists. He looked at the blood on his knuckles, the unconscious man on the ground, and felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. This was the violence he was so afraid of showing her, and now it had happened, right on her doorstep. He went inside the cabin. "You can come out," he said, his voice rough. The floorboard moved, and Hope emerged from the darkness, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide. She looked from Eli's bloody knuckles to the scene outside the open door. She saw the spatters of blood in the dust, the discarded pistol. She looked back at him, her expression a mixture of terror and something else, something that looked like awe. Before either of them could speak, another rider appeared. This one wore a tin star on his vest. Sheriff Brody. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a cold, calculating gaze. He was a tall, thin man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had long ago lost any light of justice. "McAllister," Brody said, his tone devoid of surprise. "Looks like you've been busy." "They were on my land." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice hard. "They drew on me." Brody dismounted, his movements lazy. "That's not the story I hear. Cyrus Bragg filed a complaint. Says you're harboring a runaway bride, a thief. Says she stole a locket and $50 before she fled his protection." He pulled a piece of paper from his saddlebag and unrolled it. He held it up for Eli to see. It was a wanted poster. On it was a poorly drawn sketch of a woman's face, but the words were clear. A $50 bounty for the return of Hope Whitaker, property of Cyrus Bragg. Hope, who had come to stand in the doorway, made a small, strangled sound. She was not just a runaway anymore. Now she was a criminal. The law, the very thing meant to protect the innocent, was being used as Bragg's weapon. Eli saw the last bit of fight drain out of her. Her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. "She stole nothing," Eli said through gritted teeth. "You know Bragg is lying." "All I know," Brody said, his eyes glinting with malicious satisfaction, "is that I have a warrant for her arrest. Now, you can hand her over, or I can deputize a posse and come and take her. Your choice." He looked past Eli to where Hope stood, a cruel smile touching his lips. He remembered Eli. He remembered his brother. This was a chance to settle an old score. "Get off my land, Brody," Eli said, his voice a low growl. The sheriff shrugged, a theatrical gesture of indifference. He tacked the wanted poster to a post on Eli's fence. "The bounty stands. $50 is a lot of money to the folks in this town. Someone will come for her. You can't watch her every minute." He climbed back on his horse and rode away, leaving the poster to flutter in the wind, a declaration of war against them both. Eli tore the poster down and crumpled it in his fist. He turned and went back into the cabin. Hope was standing in the middle of the room, her body trembling. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have to run, before they come back." This was it. Her old instinct, the only one that had ever kept her alive, disappear, become nothing. Eli strode over to her. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she had to look at him. His eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light she had never seen before. "No," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "There's no more running." "But I am bringing this on you," she cried, her voice rising with despair. "He will ruin you because of me. They will hang you." "Let them try," he said, his voice rough. "I am not letting you disappear, not when you have finally come back to life." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Come back to life. It was true, in this small, quiet cabin, with this silent, wounded man. She had started to feel like a person again, not just a thing to be used and discarded. He saw that. He saw her. "We are leaving," he said. "But we are leaving together. Pack what you have. We ride in 10 minutes. He saddled both horses, his own and the gentle mare he had been meaning to sell. He worked with a grim, efficient purpose. He was done reacting. Now, he would act. He would take her somewhere safe. Somewhere the long arm of Cyrus Bragg and his pet sheriff could not reach. They rode north into the high country, leaving the dusty valley and the town of Greystone behind. The trail climbed steadily, the air growing thinner and cooler. The sagebrush gave way to tall pines that smelled of resin and freedom. They rode for hours, in silence, until the sun began to sink toward the jagged peaks of the western mountains. Eli finally led them off the main trail, into a small, hidden glade. It was a beautiful, peaceful place, a meadow of tall grass surrounded by a ring of aspen trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn to gold. A small, clear stream cut through the center of the glade. In the fading light, Eli dismounted. "My mother's land," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She grew up here. My father filed a claim on it for her after they were married." He led her to one side of the glade, where 3 simple wooden crosses stood under the shade of a large pine tree. 2 were old and weathered, the names carved into them nearly gone. The 3rd was newer. The name on it was still clear: Thomas McAllister. "My parents," Eli said, gesturing to the older graves. He stopped in front of his brother's grave, his hat in his hands. "And this is Thomas." He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. "The sheriff, Brody, he is the one who hung him. Thomas was my younger brother. He was hot-headed and foolish sometimes, but he was a good man. He never got a trial. Brody and a few other men decided he was guilty, and that was that." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes full of a pain so old and deep it seemed to have no bottom. "I was away. By the time I got back, it was done. I learned that day that justice is just a word men like Brody and Bragg use to get what they want." She saw it all then, the source of his solitude, the reason for the walls around his heart. He was a man who had lost his faith in the world. He understood what it was like to be powerless against cruel men. As night fell, they built a small fire. The stars came out, a brilliant, cold scatter of diamonds against black velvet, brighter and closer than she had ever seen them. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. In the quiet of this sanctuary, the tension and fear of the past few days began to recede. She looked at him across the fire, his face grim and shadowed in the flickering light. She felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude and a feeling she was afraid to name. She stood up and walked around the fire to where he sat leaning against his saddle. She knelt in front of him. "Eli," she whispered. He looked up at her, and this time, when she leaned in to kiss him, he did not pull away. The kiss was hesitant at first, a soft, questioning touch of lips. Then it deepened, becoming something desperate, a raw and honest expression of two lonely, wounded souls finding solace in each other. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. She pressed against him, a low sound of pure, aching need escaping her throat. For a moment, he was lost in her, in the softness of her lips and the desperate hope of her touch. But then her words from that night in the cabin echoed in his mind. "The pain you're afraid to give me, I already live in it." He knew that for her. This was tangled up in all the hurt she had ever known. She was seeking not just comfort, but oblivion, an escape. And he could not be another escape that ended in pain. He broke the kiss gently, his hands moving to her shoulders. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cold night air. "I want you," he said, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. "More than you know." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his gaze intense, unwavering. "But not like this. Not when you think you deserve to hurt." Tears welled in her eyes, silent and hot. They spilled over, tracing shining paths down her cheeks in the firelight. This kindness, this refusal to take what she was so willing to give, was a language she did not understand. It hurt more than any cruelty. "It is the only thing I understand," she whispered, her voice breaking on a sob. He saw then the true depth of her wounds. It was not just her body that had been brutalized, but her very soul. She had been taught that her worth was tied to what could be taken from her, that love and pain were the same thing. He stayed with her as she cried, his hand stroking her hair. When her tears were spent, he stood up and pulled his revolver from its holster. "Come on," he said softly. "The moon is bright enough to see." He spent the next hour with her, not talking about what had just happened, but teaching her. He made her practice drawing the revolver, holding it steady, firing at pine cones he set on a log. He was patient, his voice calm and steady in the darkness. He was teaching her to survive, to be the one holding the power, not the one cowering in the dark. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, he finally spoke of his past again. He told her how he used to believe in the law, in right and wrong. "I used to think if you were a good man and worked hard, things would turn out right," he said, his voice low and bitter. "But after Thomas, I saw the truth. The world does not care if you are good. All that matters is who has the power." He looked over at her, his expression softening. "All I believe in now is protecting the ones no one else will." When they finally lay down to sleep, they spread their bedrolls side by side. The air was cold, and a deep chill had settled into the glade. After a few minutes of lying stiff and silent in the darkness, she shifted, moving closer to him, seeking his warmth. She curled into his side, her head resting on his shoulder, as naturally and trustingly as a child who has never known a reason to be afraid. Eli lay perfectly still, his arm around her, holding her close. He did not feel desire now, only a fierce, overwhelming need to protect this fragile, breathing warmth in his arms. She was not a temptation. She was a trust, and in the deep, silent peace of the mountain glade, he swore to himself that he would not fail this one. The sanctuary of the mountain glade could not last. It was a pause, a breath taken in the midst of a long and desperate run. But the world below was waiting for them, patient and predatory. After 2 days, their meager supplies were gone, and the cold of the high country was a constant, biting reminder of their vulnerability. They had to go back. The ride down from the mountains was a descent back into a war they had only postponed. The change in Greystone was immediate and absolute. It was no longer a town of cold shoulders and suspicious whispers. It was a place of open hostility. Cyrus Bragg had moved from rumor to open declaration. On the wall of the saloon, on the door of the general store, even tacked to the town's central well, were new flyers. The paper was cheap, the ink a bold, ugly black. At the top, in large letters, were the words, "Stolen Wife." Below was the same crude sketch of Hope's face from the wanted poster. But the text was different, more personal, more poisonous. It claimed that the woman known as Hope Whitaker was the legally contracted wife of Cyrus Bragg, and that she had been abducted by the outlaw Eli McAllister. It offered a reward not for her capture, but for information leading to the arrest of McAllister and the safe return of Bragg's beloved, albeit confused, bride. It was a masterful piece of cruelty. In a few dozen words, Bragg had stripped Hope of her name and her will, turning her into a piece of property, and painted Eli not as a protector, but as a kidnapper and a thief. He had twisted their story into something sordid and ugly, and held it up for the entire town to see and condemn. Eli tore one of the flyers from the wall of the blacksmith's shop, his face a mask of cold fury. He crumpled it in his fist, the paper crackling in the tense silence. Hope, waiting on her horse, looked away, a flush of deep, burning shame on her cheeks. She felt the stares of the few people on the street like physical blows. Every eye in Greystone now saw her as a stolen thing, a sullied prize in a feud between two men. The flyers were only the beginning. Bragg's campaign of humiliation was followed by a war of attrition. The town, either out of fear of Bragg or genuine moral outrage, began to actively work against them. The boycott was now total and suffocating. When Eli tried to water his horses at the public trough, he found the pump handle had been removed. When he rode out to check his small herd of cattle, he found a section of his fence cut, the wire snipped clean through, allowing two of his best steers to wander off into the canyons. He spent a day tracking them, his anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He found them both, but it was too late. They were lying by a small, stagnant pool of water, their bodies bloated, their legs stiff. They had been poisoned. The waterhole had been deliberately fouled. It was a message, clear and brutal. You are not welcome here. Your livelihood is forfeit. He rode back to the cabin as dusk was settling, the grim news heavy on his shoulders. He found Hope by the hearth, scrubbing a cast-iron pot with a fierce, desperate energy, as if she could scour away the filth that had attached itself to their lives. She looked up as he entered, and she saw the answer to an unspoken question in the grim set of his jaw. "The cattle?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Gone," he said, his voice flat. He tossed his hat onto its peg and sank into a chair at the table, the weariness of the past few weeks finally settling into his bones. She put down the pot and came to stand before him, her hands twisting in the simple apron she had fashioned from a spare flour sack. Her face was pale, her eyes full of a pain that was almost too much to bear. "This is my fault," she said, the words choked with guilt. "All of it. The town, the fence, the cattle. It is all because of me." "No," he said, his voice rough. "It is because of men like Bragg." "But he is doing it to get to me," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "He is hurting you to make you give me up. Eli, you have to let me go. I will run. I will go far away where he can never find me. Then this will all stop." She was begging him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She truly believed that her disappearance was the only way to save him, that she was a curse he had foolishly taken upon himself. "You are hurting because of me." He looked at her, at the genuine anguish on her face, at the self-loathing that had been so deeply ingrained in her she could not see her own worth. A fire ignited in him, a fierce, protective anger that burned away his exhaustion. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip strong and unyielding. She flinched at the sudden contact, but he did not let go. He held her hand tight, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense, each word sharp with conviction. "They are not hurting me. They are trying to. There is a difference." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "If they think I will give you up to keep peace, if they think I will trade you for a few head of cattle and the good opinion of a town full of cowards, then they do not know me at all." He let go of her hand, but the heat of his grip seemed to linger on her skin. She stared at him, stunned into silence by the ferocity of his loyalty. In her world, people were given up, sold, traded. They were bargaining chips, liabilities. No one had ever declared her worth fighting for. No one had ever looked at her and seen something to be protected at all costs. The idea was so foreign, so overwhelming, it left her breathless. But as the days passed, the pressure only increased. Every trip to the edge of town was a reminder of their isolation. Every cold stare, every slammed door, was another stone piled on the wall that was cutting them off from the world. Hope saw the lines of strain around Eli's eyes deepen. She saw the way his hand always rested near his gun, the constant, weary vigilance that had become his new reality. And her guilt grew, a poisonous weed twisting around her heart. His declaration had moved her, but it had not convinced her. She saw his defense of her not as a noble act, but as a slow suicide. And she was the weapon he was pointing at his own head. A decision began to form in the quietest, most desperate corners of her mind. It was a terrible, desperate plan, born of a lifetime of believing she was the cause of all pain. If he would not let her go, then she would have to go herself. She could offer Bragg the one thing he wanted, the one thing that would make him stop his war on Eli, herself. She waited for a night with no moon, when the sky was a blanket of impenetrable black. Eli had spent the day mending the fence, his body tired, and he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep almost as soon as he lay down on his bedroll on the porch. Hope lay on the cot inside, her eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the sound of his steady breathing. Every breath he took was a fresh torment, a reminder of the life she was putting in jeopardy. When she was sure he was asleep, she slipped out of the cot. Her movements were silent, practiced from a lifetime of trying to be invisible. She dressed in the dark, her hands steady, her resolve a cold, hard stone in her gut. She packed nothing. She would not need her satchel where she was going. She scribbled a short, clumsy note on a piece of scrap paper she found in a drawer. "He will leave you alone now. I am sorry." She left it on the table where he would see it. She went to the stable, the mare, the one he had given her to ride, nickered softly as she approached. She saddled the horse with trembling hands. The familiar task, a strange comfort in the terrifying unreality of the night. She led the horse out of the stable and a good distance from the cabin before she mounted, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She took one last look at the small, dark cabin, a tiny point of light and warmth in a world of darkness. It was the only real home she had ever known. Then she turned the horse and rode toward the sprawling, dark shadow in the valley that was the Bragg Ranch. Cyrus Bragg's estate was a fortress. A long white fence surrounded acres of perfectly manicured pasture land. The main house was a 2-story monstrosity, a monument to a man's greed, with wide porches and tall windows that stared out into the night like vacant eyes. She was stopped at the main gate by 2 guards, their rifles glinting in the lantern light. "I am here to see Mr. Bragg," she said, her voice small but clear in the vast silence. "My name is Hope Whitaker." The name caused a stir. The guards exchanged a look, and one of them disappeared into the darkness toward the main house. He returned a few minutes later. "Mr. Bragg will see you. Get down." She was led into the house, into a large, opulent study filled with dark, heavy furniture, the heads of dead animals on the walls, and the smell of cigar smoke and leather. Cyrus Bragg was sitting behind a massive oak desk, a decanter of amber liquid at his elbow. He was older than she had expected, with silver hair and a soft, fleshy face, but his eyes were cold and reptilian, and they moved over her with a disturbing possessiveness. "Well, well," he said, a slow, self-satisfied smile spreading across his face. "The lost lamb returns to the fold. I knew you would come to your senses. Did you get tired of sleeping in the dirt with that half-wild animal? McAllister?" Hope stood straight, her hands clenched at her sides. "I have come to make a bargain," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I will stay. I will do what you want. But you must leave Eli McAllister alone. You will call off your men. You will stop the attacks. You will let him live in peace." Bragg laughed, a rich, booming sound that held no humor. "My dear girl, you are in no position to bargain. You are my property. You are here because I willed it, but—" he held up a hand, a gesture of magnanimity. "I am a reasonable man. I will accept your terms." He smiled again. "Of course, your protector might have other ideas. A man like McAllister, he has too much pride. He will come for you. And when he does," his smile widened, "when he steps onto my land to try and steal my property, he will be shot dead, legally, and then I will have you, and he will be gone. So you see, we both get what we want." He stood up and walked around the desk. Hope flinched as he came near, but she held her ground. He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his fingers, his touch making her skin crawl. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," he murmured. "We will have to address that. Harlan," he called out. The big, bearded foreman appeared in the doorway. "Take Miss Whitaker downstairs. Find her a secure room. She is to be our guest until her friend arrives." Harlan grinned and grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. He dragged her from the room, down a long hallway, and to a heavy wooden door. He unlocked it, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into darkness. It was a cellar. He shoved her forward, and she stumbled down the steps, landing hard on the cold, damp earth floor. The door slammed shut above her, and she heard the heavy bolt slide into place. She was alone in the pitch black, the smell of damp earth and rot filling her lungs. She had not bought Eli's peace. She had only baited Bragg's trap. Eli woke to a profound and unsettling silence. The usual pre-dawn sounds, the soft shifting of the mare in the stable, were absent. A cold dread washed over him. He sat up, his bedroll cold. He stood and pushed open the cabin door. The cot was empty. The blanket was folded neatly, as if she were a polite guest who had just departed. "Hope!" he called out, his voice sharp with alarm. There was no answer. He saw the note on the table. His hands trembled as he read the simple, heartbreaking words. A wave of cold fury, colder and more absolute than anything he had ever felt, washed through him. He did not waste time on grief or despair. He moved. He strode to the stable. The mare's stall was empty. He looked at the ground outside. In the faint, gray light of dawn, he could see the tracks, a single horse, moving at a steady walk, heading east, toward the Bragg Ranch. He was not a fool. He knew exactly what she had done, the terrible, selfless sacrifice she had made. He worked with a deadly, focused calm. He saddled Dust Devil, his movements swift and sure. He checked his rifle, loading a round into the chamber. He slid his Colt from its holster, checked the cylinder, and slid it back. He took extra ammunition. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to bargain. He was a storm going to tear through the land, and he would not stop until he had her back. He followed her tracks, his eyes reading the story in the dirt. He could see where she had started, where she had mounted. He rode hard, Dust Devil's hooves eating up the miles. He did not think about the odds. He did not think about the number of men Bragg had. He thought only of her face, of her fierce, fragile spirit, and of the cellar he knew she was probably in. He reached the edge of Bragg's property as the sun was climbing the sky. He did not go to the main gate. He rode along the fence line until he found a low spot, and then he urged Dust Devil over it. He dismounted, leaving the horse in a thicket of trees, and proceeded on foot, his rifle in his hand. He moved through the trees like a ghost, his senses on fire. He saw 2 guards patrolling the perimeter. He waited until they passed, then slipped past them. He approached the house from the rear. There was a large barn, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and the main house itself. He could hear the sounds of men waking, of breakfast being made. He had no plan other than to get inside and find her. He circled the house, staying low, until he found a small window on the ground floor, leading into what looked like a pantry. It was unlocked. He slid it open and slipped inside, silent as a shadow. He found himself in a large kitchen. A cook was at the stove, his back to the window. Eli moved with lethal speed, crossing the room and pressing the barrel of his rifle into the man's back. "Where is she?" he whispered, his voice a deadly rasp. The cook, terrified, could only point a trembling finger toward the cellar door. Eli left the cook bound and gagged in the pantry. He moved to the cellar door. It was bolted from the outside. He slid the bolt back as quietly as he could and pulled the heavy door open. "Hope," he called softly into the darkness. A faint, choked cry came from below. "Eli?" "I am coming," he said. He started down the steps, his rifle ready. He was halfway down when the trap was sprung. The kitchen door burst open. "He is in the cellar!" a voice yelled. Eli spun around, firing a shot up the stairs that sent the men scrambling for cover. He reached the bottom of the steps and pulled Hope to her feet. "Are you hurt?" "No," she sobbed, clinging to him. There was no time. Men were already starting down the stairs. Eli shoved her behind him. "Stay back," he ordered. He fired again, and one of the men screamed and tumbled down the steps. But there were too many of them. Harlan, the big foreman, appeared at the top of the stairs, a shotgun in his hands. "It is over. McAllister!" Suddenly, another shot rang out, not from Eli's rifle, but from behind him. It was sharp and loud in the confined space. Harlan grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face. He staggered, dropping the shotgun, and then fell forward, a dark hole appearing in his chest. Eli turned. Hope was standing there, her arm outstretched, the Colt revolver he had given her held in both her trembling hands. Smoke curled from the barrel. She had saved his life. The momentary shock gave them the opening they needed. Eli grabbed her hand. "Come on!" he yelled. They scrambled up the stairs. Past Harlan's body, they burst into the kitchen just as Cyrus Bragg himself appeared in the doorway. A pistol in his hand, Bragg fired. Eli felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder. He stumbled, his rifle clattering to the floor. The impact spun him around. Bragg raised his pistol to fire again, a triumphant sneer on his face. But Hope reacted first. She did not fire. She threw herself at Bragg, a wild, desperate tackle that sent them both crashing into a table of dishes. The pistol flew from Bragg's hand. Eli, clutching his bleeding shoulder, grabbed her. "We have to go, now!" He pulled her through the kitchen and out the back door. Gunshots erupted behind them. They ran, zigzagging across the open yard toward the trees where he had left the horse. A bullet sang past Eli's ear. Another kicked up dirt at Hope's feet. They reached the trees, and he threw her onto Dust Devil's back, then hauled himself up behind her, his wounded arm screaming in protest. He kicked the horse into a gallop, and they crashed through the underbrush, away from the ranch, away from the gunfire, fleeing into the wild, unforgiving hills. They rode until the horse was lathered and Eli was faint from blood loss. He found a small, hidden cave set into the side of a rocky cliff, a place an old trapper might have used, barely big enough for them and the horse. He slid from the saddle, his legs giving way, and collapsed onto the cave floor. Hope was at his side in an instant, her face a mask of terror and grief. She tore a strip of fabric from her dress and pressed it against the wound in his shoulder. Her hands covered in his blood. He was bleeding badly, his breathing shallow. She sobbed, great, heaving, silent sobs of a terror and guilt so profound it had no voice. He was dying. He was dying because of her. She had tried to save him, and instead, she had led him to his death. He reached up with his good hand and touched her cheek. his fingers smearing blood on her skin. "Not your fault," he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. There, in the cold, damp darkness of the cave, with the smell of his blood and her tears filling the air, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. She leaned down, pressing her lips to his, a kiss not of passion, but of desperate, life-affirming need. He was alive. They were alive. In a world that had tried to kill them, they were still breathing. She tended to his wound as best she could, cleaning it with water from their canteen. And as he drifted in and out of a feverish consciousness, and as she sobbed in the darkness, they finally gave in to the deep, aching love that had grown between them in the midst of violence and fear. It was slow, and it was wordless. It was a desperate clinging of two survivors, a silent promise made in the dark that as long as they were together, they were not alone. It was the only comfort, the only truth, left in their shattered world. Time in the cave was measured not in days, but in the slow, agonizing rhythm of healing. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the damp chill of the rock, the low flicker of their small, smoky fires, and the constant, throbbing presence of Eli's wound. In the first few days, a fever took him, leaving him shivering and delirious. In those moments, their roles were completely reversed. He was helpless, and hope became his anchor to the living world. He taught her what needed to be done, his voice a low rasp in the darkness. She learned to clean the wound with water boiled in their single tin cup, a painstaking process that made him grit his teeth and break out in a cold sweat. She learned to recognize the angry red edges that spoke of infection and how to use the last of their whiskey to cauterize the tissue, a brutal act that left her shaking and him blessedly unconscious for a time. She became a hunter, taking the revolver he had given her and venturing into the sparse woods around the cave. She would return with a squirrel or a rabbit, her face grim with determination, and they would roast the small animal over the fire, the meat keeping their strength up. She found a patch of snow in a shaded ravine that had not yet melted, and she would bring back handfuls to melt for clean, cold water. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found on the trail. That person had been burned away in the fire of the last few days. In her place was a woman, forged in fear and tempered by necessity, her movements now sure and her eyes clear and focused. He would watch her as she worked, a deep, quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had wanted her to come back to life, and here she was, more fiercely alive than anyone he had ever known. Their love, born in a moment of desperate, shared trauma, deepened in the long, quiet hours of that shared survival. It was a love that existed beyond words. It was in the way she would gently lift his head to give him water. It was in the way his good hand would find hers in the darkness and hold it while she slept. It was in the shared understanding that passed between them in a single glance across the fire. They were two halves of a single, scarred soul, and in this small, hidden place, they were, for the first time, whole. One night, as the fever finally broke and a fragile clarity returned to Eli's eyes, they were sitting by the fire, the silence comfortable and deep. He was leaning against the cave wall, and she was resting her head on his good shoulder. The intimacy was as natural as breathing now, a simple, profound fact of their existence. In that quiet safety, she finally gave him the last, most heavily guarded piece of herself. "My mother died when I was born," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the fire's crackle. He felt the words more than heard them, a vibration against his shoulder. "They said it was my fault, that I was born with a curse on me." She told him of a childhood spent in the shadow of that curse. Her stepfather, her aunts, the few neighbors they had, they all looked at her as if she were a bad omen, the living embodiment of a tragedy. Every misfortune, a failed crop, a sick animal, was laid at her feet. She was the girl who had killed her own mother just by entering the world. "My stepfather used to say it all the time," she whispered, her voice thick with a lifetime of shame. He would get drunk and look at me and say, "You took her from me. You owe me." He told me I was born unworthy, that the only good I would ever be was what a man would pay for me. She shuddered against him. I think a part of me believed him. When he made the deal with a Mr. Bragg, it almost felt right, like that was what I was for, to be sold to pay a debt, to be a thing that could be traded for something of value. Eli's arm tightened around her, his heart aching with a fierce, protective rage. He thought of this small, resilient woman who had survived so much, carrying the weight of that poison inside her for her entire life. He tilted her chin up with his good hand, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were shimmering with tears, the firelight dancing in their depths. He gently kissed the tears from her cheeks, his lips a soft, reverent touch. He looked deep into her eyes, his own gaze burning with an intensity that seemed to push back the shadows. "They do not get to name you," he said, his voice a low, rough growl of absolute conviction. "Your stepfather, Bragg, none of them. What they said, what they did, that is their filth, not yours." He leaned his forehead against hers. "You are not theirs. Hope, you never were." The words were a release, a key turning in a lock she had not even known was there. She wept then, a deep, cleansing flood of tears for the little girl who had been told she was a curse, for the young woman who had believed she was worthless. He held her through it all, a silent, unmovable rock in the storm of her grief. They stayed in the cave for 4 more days, until Eli's wound had begun to close and his strength was returning. They knew they could not hide in the hills forever. Sooner or later, Bragg's men would organize a real search party. Their life in the cave was an act of survival, but it was not a life. "We cannot run forever, Eli," Hope said one morning, as she watched him test the strength in his wounded arm. "There is nowhere to go where he will not look for us." "I know," he said, his face grim. "Running is what he wants. He wants us to be scared, to live like hunted animals. As long as we are hiding, he has won." A new resolve was hardening in both of them, born from the intimacy of the cave and the injustice of their situation. They had been pushed and hunted and broken, but they were not broken anymore. "Then we go back," Hope said, her voice quiet but firm. The thought terrified her, but the thought of a lifetime of looking over her shoulder terrified her more. Eli looked at her, seeing the steel in her eyes. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "We go back," he agreed. "But not to hide, not to run. We go back with a plan." The plan was simple, desperate, and dangerous. They would not fight Bragg on his terms, with ambushes and running gun battles. They would fight him with the one weapon he had no defense against: the truth. They would ride back into Greystone, not in the dead of night, but in the middle of the day. They would walk into the saloon, the dark heart of the town, and they would confront him in front of everyone. They would tell their story, expose his crimes, and show Sheriff Brody for the paid coward he was. They would force the people of Greystone, the silent, complicit townspeople, to see the truth and to finally choose a side. It was a gamble that would likely get them both killed, but it was better than dying slowly in the wilderness or living forever under Bragg's shadow. They rode into Greystone just after noon. The town was quiet, the midday sun baking the dust in the main street. They had one horse between them, Dust Devil, and Eli sat in the saddle with Hope seated behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. Eli's arm was in a sling she had fashioned from a piece of blanket, and his face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear and hard. Hope wore her tattered, blood-stained dress, a silent testament to the violence she had endured. They were a grim, desperate sight, and as they rode down the street, doors closed and windows were shuttered. They stopped in front of the saloon. Eli dismounted, then helped Hope down. He took his Colt from its holster and handed it to her. "Just like we practiced," he said softly. She gave him a shaky nod. her hand closing around the familiar weight of the gun. She tucked it into the waistband of her dress, hidden by the folds of the fabric. Eli kept his rifle, holding it loosely in his good hand. He pushed open the swinging doors, and they stepped inside. The saloon was crowded. Ranch hands, farmers, and merchants were at the bar and the tables, their conversations and laughter filling the smoky room. But the moment Eli and Hope stepped inside, a sudden, absolute silence fell. Every man in the room froze, their eyes turning to the doorway. And then they saw him. Cyrus Bragg was sitting at a large table in the back, holding court with Sheriff Brody and 2 of his hired guns. Bragg looked up, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face when he saw them. He had not had to hunt them down. His prey had walked right back into the trap. "Well, now," Bragg said, his voice booming in the silent room. "Look what the cat dragged in. McAllister, I see you got my message, and you brought my property back with you. I appreciate your cooperation." Eli ignored him. He and Hope walked slowly toward the center of the room, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. Every eye followed them. Hope's heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But she lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping across the hostel. Curious faces of the townsfolk. She stopped in the middle of the room. She was just a girl in a torn dress, pale and thin, but she stood as if she had a spine of steel. And then she began to speak, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick, tense air. "My name is Hope Whitaker," she began. "It is not my name by law, but it is the name I have chosen. Mr. Bragg calls me his wife. That is a lie." She told them everything. She spoke of her stepfather, of his gambling debts, of the contract he had signed. "I was sold," she said, her voice ringing with a truth that was impossible to deny. "Like a horse or a head of cattle. I was a debt to be paid. I was never his wife. I was his purchase." She told them of her escape, of Eli finding her near death on the trail. She told them of the men Bragg sent, of the beating at the cabin, of the bounty, of the lies Bragg and the sheriff had spread. Her voice never wavered. She was not asking for their pity. She was demanding their witness. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Bragg, "does not want a wife. He wants a slave. And this town, you have all helped him. You have looked the other way because you are afraid. I was afraid, too, but I will not be afraid anymore." When she finished, the silence in the room was as heavy as a shroud. No one moved. No one spoke. Bragg's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of cold, murderous rage. Eli stepped forward, his rifle held loosely at his side. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the room. "And it is a truth many of you have known for years. Cyrus Bragg runs this valley with fear. He buys your land when you cannot pay his prices at the store he owns. He takes your water rights with contracts you cannot read. He threatens your families. And he uses the law as his personal weapon." He looked at Sheriff Brody, his eyes filled with contempt. "This man does not serve you. He serves the man who pays him." A low murmur went through the crowd. Men shifted their feet, their gazes dropping to the floor. They knew it was the truth. They had all lived under Bragg's thumb for years. "That is enough," Brody bellowed. Finding his voice, he stood up, his hand on his pistol. "McAllister, you are under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and murder. The only murderer in this room is the man who let my brother hang without a trial," Eli shot back, his voice raw with old grief. The tension in the room was about to snap. Men started to move, some reaching for their guns, others backing away toward the walls. A full-scale brawl was seconds from erupting. Bragg saw he was losing control. The fear he relied on was being replaced by something else, something dangerous. He stood up, his face purple with rage, and drew his pistol. "She is a liar and a whore!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "And you are a dead man, McAllister!" He swung the pistol, not at Eli, but at Hope. It was the last mistake he ever made. Eli moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. He did not even seem to aim. The rifle came up. There was a single, deafening boom that shook the entire saloon, and a neat black hole appeared in the center of Cyrus Bragg's chest. Bragg staggered backward, a look of utter shock on his face. He looked down at the hole in his shirt, then back at Eli. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He crashed backward over his table, dead before he hit the floor. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then chaos erupted. Bragg's 2 men drew their guns. But before they could fire, 2 shots rang out from the crowd. Old man Abernathy, the store clerk, was standing with a smoking pistol in his hand, his face pale but resolute. Doc Miller stood beside him, also armed. "That is enough killing," Abernathy shouted. Sheriff Brody, his face white with fury and fear, raised his own pistol, pointing it at Eli. "Drop the rifle, McAllister! You are under arrest for murder!" "The hell he is!" a voice called out. It was a farmer whose land bordered Bragg's. He drew his own gun and pointed it at the sheriff. Bragg got what was coming to him. Suddenly, 6 other men in the room drew their weapons. All of them pointed at the sheriff. They were farmers, ranchers, blacksmiths, the ordinary men of the town who had finally had enough. They were a makeshift army, a riot waiting to happen. Brody looked at the faces arrayed against him, and for the first time, he saw that his power, the power he had bought from Bragg, was gone. He slowly, reluctantly, lowered his gun. In the sudden, tense quiet, Hope walked forward. She stepped over the shattered remains of the table and stood over Cyrus Bragg's body. He lay on his back, his dead eyes staring up at the ceiling, his fancy clothes stained with his own blood. She looked down at the man who had bought her, who had hunted her, the source of all her fear. She felt nothing, no pity, no remorse, only a great vast emptiness where the fear used to be. She looked up at Eli, who was watching her, his face grim. Then she looked back down at the dead man. "Now," she said, her voice quiet but carrying through the silent, watchful room. "Now I know what justice tastes like." The gunshot that killed Cyrus Bragg was like a thunderclap that broke a long and terrible drought. For a moment, the silence it left behind was absolute, filled with the blue haze of gun smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Then, the standoff dissolved not into further violence, but into a slow, collective exhalation of breath from the men who had lived in fear for so long. The spell was broken. The king was dead. Sheriff Brody, his face the color of spoiled milk, found himself utterly alone, a man without a master. The guns pointed at him did not waver. It was Doc Miller who finally spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying the authority of a man who had brought most of the people in that room into the world and patched them up ever since. "Brody," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "take off that star. You are done in this town." For a moment, it seemed Brody might try to fight, to cling to the last vestiges of his corrupt power. But he looked at the hard faces surrounding him, at the bodies of Bragg and his men on the floor, and he saw the end of his road. With trembling fingers, he unpinned the tin star from his vest and let it fall to the sawdust-covered floor. It landed with a soft, dull thud. In the weeks that followed, Greystone began to breathe again. A rider was sent to the territorial capital with a full report, signed by 12 of the town's leading citizens. It told of Bragg's reign, of Brody's corruption, and of the final, bloody confrontation in the saloon. The law, when it finally arrived, was not vengeful. A circuit judge listened to the testimony of Eli, Hope, and half the town. The killing of Cyrus Bragg was ruled a justifiable act of defense. The case was closed. Brody was given 24 hours to leave the territory, and he rode out of town with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, not a single person turning to watch him go. A new marshal was sent to Greystone. His name was Samuel Peters, a young man from the East with a square jaw, earnest blue eyes, and a copy of the territorial statutes that he read every night. He was honest and well-intentioned, but he knew nothing of the country or the hard men who lived in it. He recognized in Eli not an outlaw, but a man who understood the brutal language of the land. He came to Eli's cabin a month after the showdown, his hat in his hand. "Mr. McAllister," he said, his voice respectful, "I could use a man like you to help me deputize and train a few good men who know this valley, men who understand what justice is supposed to look like here." Eli, who had sworn off the law and its institutions forever, found himself looking at the young marshal's hopeful face, and then at Hope, who stood on the porch, a small, encouraging smile on her lips. He had told her that all he believed in now was protecting the ones no one else would. Perhaps, he thought, that could mean more than just one person. Perhaps it could mean a whole town. He agreed. And so, a new, quiet life began to take root in the soil of the old one. Eli and Hope lived on his small piece of land, the cabin no longer a fortress against the world, but a home. The fences that had been cut were mended, the wood stronger than before. The 2 cattle he had lost were replaced by 4, a gift from a neighboring rancher who came by one morning, his face a mixture of shame and gratitude. "We should have stood with you sooner," was all he said. They planted a small spring garden behind the cabin. Hope would kneel in the dark, rich earth, her hands sinking into the soil, and a feeling of profound peace would settle over her. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was putting down roots. She found a purpose beyond the cabin as well. On the edge of town was an old, abandoned schoolhouse, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging. It had been closed for years. The children of Greystone who had families learned what they could at home, but there were others. The orphans, the children of ranch hands who had died in accidents or saloon fights, who had nowhere to go and no one to teach them. They were the forgotten ones, the strays, much like she had been. With the help of Doc Miller's wife and a few other women from the town, Hope started to rebuild it. They swept out the dust and the ghosts, patched the roof, and replaced the broken panes of glass. Hope spent hours sanding the old, scarred wooden desks, smoothing away the gouges and initials left by children long since grown, making them ready for a new generation. She found she had a talent for it, a patient, gentle way with the children, especially the girls who were shy and withdrawn. She saw herself in them, and she was determined that they would learn they were more than what the world might try to name them. They would learn to read, and to write, and to believe in their own worth. The townsfolk, who had once stared at them with hatred and suspicion, now watched them with a kind of quiet awe. They had seen Hope's courage in the saloon, a bravery that had shamed their own fear into action. They had seen Eli's unwavering loyalty, a fierce devotion that had cost him almost everything. The town softening toward them was a slow, gradual thaw. It came in small gestures. A sack of flour left on their porch, a friendly nod in the street, an invitation from the new marshal to join a town meeting. Guilt was a powerful motivator, but what grew from it was a genuine, hard-won respect. Eli would ride out with the new deputies, teaching them how to track, how to read the signs of the land, how to survive in a place that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. He taught them that the law was not just about the gun on your hip, but about the conviction in your heart. He was a harder, colder man than he had been before his brother's death, but the ice around his heart was beginning to melt, thawed by the steady, quiet warmth of the woman who waited for him at home. One evening, as summer began to settle over the valley, they sat together on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky was a breathtaking spectacle of orange and pink and deep, royal purple. The air was warm and smelled of pine and the dust of a long, dry day. A profound quiet had settled over the land, the kind of peace that feels as if it might last forever. Hope leaned her head against his shoulder, her body relaxed and at ease in a way that would have been impossible just a few months before. She was no longer a taut wire, humming with fear. She was simply a woman, sitting with the man she loved, watching a beautiful sunset. The sheer, simple normalcy of it was a miracle. "I never thought I would live to see something beautiful and believe it was mine," she said, her voice a soft, wondering murmur. The words were not sad. They were a statement of fact, a measurement of the vast distance she had traveled from the darkness she had once inhabited. Eli wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her closer. His shoulder had healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that he would carry for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the price they had paid. He looked out at the spectacular, painted sky, and then he looked down at her, at the way the last light of the day caught in her pale hair. "You are not broken," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper against her hair. "You are forged. Iron goes into the fire weak and comes out steel. It is bent and beaten and held in the flames, but it comes out stronger than it ever was." He pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "That makes you stronger than anyone I have ever known." She turned her face into his chest, her heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. The past was still there. It would always be there. They both carried its scars, visible and invisible. The memory of her stepfather's cruelty, of Bragg's cold eyes, of the cellar's darkness, would never fade completely. The ghost of Eli's brother still walked in the quiet places of his heart. But those things no longer defined them. They were a part of their story, the fire that had forged them. But they were not the end of the story. She took his hand, the one that had held her, and fought for her. And she brought it to her chest, holding it flat against her heart so he could feel it steady, even beat. "I used to think pain was all I would ever feel," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. She lifted her head and looked into his eyes, her own shining with a truth that was as bright and clear as the first star appearing in the twilight sky. "Now, I think maybe I was just waiting for you." He did not need to answer. The reply was in the way his eyes softened, in the way his hand tightened its grip over her heart. It was in the gentle, certain pressure of his lips as he leaned down to kiss her. It was a kiss not of desperation or of grief, but of a deep and abiding peace, a kiss that promised 1,000 more sunsets, a lifetime of shared silence and quiet understanding. The next morning, they rode out together, not to run, not to hide, but simply to ride. He was on Dust Devil, and she was on the gentle mare, her seat in the saddle now confident and sure. They rode north, toward the high country, the rising sun at their backs, casting their long shadows before them. They were two survivors, scarred but not broken, no longer defined by the ghosts that haunted them, no longer afraid of the love that had saved them. They rode on, together, into the wide, open, and unknown country of the rest of their lives. Thank you for joining us in this telling of our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow enthusiasts. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.